In the event that monsters descend upon your town, I happen to know a group of 12-year-olds that you would call for just that very occasion. We're going to talk about them today on Aging Gracefully. I am Matthew Essex. We, of course, are talking about the 1987 classic, The Monster Squad, directed by Fred Dekker. Now, we start this movie off, presumably in Transylvania. Creepy crypt. We meet Dracula, because what's a monster movie without Dracula? And he's an okay version of Dracula. You know, he's top 10, but he's more like a birthday party Dracula. He's got some cheesiness to him. But here he is in full force, and where you have Dracula, you have Van Helsing. Now, the gist is Van Helsing is there to break up Dracula's party and use an amulet that more closely resembles a cubic zirconia to open a hole into limbo and eliminate all the evil from the scene. Things don't go well, and everybody gets sucked into it. Then we fast forward to present day. And just a quick anecdote, when it said present day across the screen as a child, that really confused me because I didn't know what present day meant. I thought it was a day that I wasn't privy to because we were poor and we didn't have very many present days. But turns out that's not the fact. Anyways, I digress. We get to the principal's office with Sean and Patrick. Now, those are going to be two of the central figures of the movie. Sean, of course, is the leader of the Monster Club, as they're called in the onset. And Patrick is his sidekick. And I can't help but feel like they wanted Corey Haim, but they got Patrick. Because Patrick very closely resembles what a Dollar Tree Corey Haim would be. No offense to Patrick, he's a solid character, but Corey Haim, he is not. Shortly after that, we are introduced to the rest of the group. Fat Kid, who we will refer to by his birth name of Horace because we're not getting canceled here. We have Rudy, who is the older, cooler kid. Quick story, Horace gets bullied by the kid from Wonder Years, so Horace has no street credibility at the onset of this film. He makes up for it down the line. We also have Phoebe, who is Sean's little sister. We have Pete the dog, who's adorable, and we have Eugene, who's the smallest of the bunch. That pretty much composes our Monster Club, who then morph into the Monster Squad about a half an hour into the movie. One of the best parts of this movie, Richie Aprile from The Sopranos is the guy flying the plane that's carrying the dead monster corpses. I didn't realize it at the time, obviously, because The Sopranos wasn't a thing in 1987, but as a fan who's watched that series 7 or 8 times through, coming back to this movie and seeing Richie Aprile flying the plane was fantastic. We get to a point where we meet Sean's parents, and Sean's dad is a cop. He's having marital problems, and being a child from the 80s, I certainly know what that was like growing up in. But you can see he cares about his kids, and there's a cool scene where they're sitting on top of a roof, Sean and his father, and they are looking out onto the drive-in with a set of binoculars to watch Groundhog Day Part 12. And a quick aside, anytime you see a horror movie within a horror movie, I just think it's really cool. I mean, it makes me think of Better Off Dead with John Cusack when he's at the date with the chick that he's not supposed to be with, and he gets a giant tub of popcorn so he keeps enough room between them for the Holy Ghost because the chick actually has a boyfriend and they're watching a horror movie. Fantastic. Really cool stuff. So anytime you see a horror movie within a horror movie, I pop for that. Then we happen upon the part of the movie where we meet the rest of the bad guys. Now we have the Wolfman getting shot. We have the mummy who breaks out of the museum he's been asleep in. We have the creature from the Black Lagoon doing his best Brock Lesnar impression and hurling the cargo box that Frankenstein's monster's body is kept in and it landing at the feet of Dracula. Now Dracula's instructions for Frankenstein's monster are very simple. Go get the diary from the kids, and if they give you any grief, go ahead and 86 them. Frankenstein immediately sides with the children. He essentially becomes an honorary member of the Monster Squad. There is a very sad little moment in there where they're all getting to know one another, and Frankenstein's monster is handed a box with a costume of himself, presumably, in it. He looks at the mask, and then he touches his face and asks the kids if he's scary. Sad music. It got you in the feels a little bit when you were a kid, and it still gets me to this day. But the guy, Tom Noonan, I believe, is the guy who played Frankenstein's monster in this movie. Kills it. He's just fantastic. So from there, we go to the scary German guy's house as they call him in the movie, because the diary's in German. They need to translate it to figure out what they have to do. He essentially tells them the story of Limbo, the amulet, and the fact that this is all going down in 24 hours tomorrow night. That's when they've got to kick it into high gear. We have a weapons making montage in this movie that is so good because it's set to 80s music. It's just about these kids doing everything they can to prepare for these monsters. It's over the top, but it's really funny and it's really well done. And apparently back in the 80s you could make bullets in high school. I didn't know that. I couldn't do it in the 90s, but in the 80s it was a thing to do. So the next scene we happen upon is the kids showing up to the mansion where Dracula's been hiding out. Dracula hears them show up. The dynamite that Dracula is planning to use to blow a hole in the wall to get to the amulet somehow goes off, and boom, Frankenstein is buried under a bunch of rubble from the house. The Monster Squad's #1 weapon has now been downed. However, we get to the Wolfman's Got Nards scene. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you need to go back and watch the movie. And if you do know what I'm talking about, then you probably grew up properly in the 80s and you went to school and used that very phrase, Wolfman's Got Nards, with your friends several times on the playground throughout the day. Probably even reenacted it a few times. That means you grew up well. If you didn't, you had a bad upbringing, and I feel very sorry for you. Now, at this point, Dracula is pissed. These kids turned his monster against him. They showed up to his crib. They took his chunk of plastic that he was passing off as an amulet, and they bounced. He's not going to take that lying down, so he shows up, blows up Sean's treehouse with a stick of dynamite, drops a cheesy 80s quip by saying meeting adjourned, and he takes off before having a little bit of dialogue with the parents, assuring them that their son, in fact, now belongs to him. Boom, we're right into the final battle. Now we're not going to get into the ending of the movie scene by scene because I feel like it's something you should probably see if you haven't already seen it. This movie ages gracefully. I gave it a 7 out of 10. I only took a couple of points off from it because for me, there's a couple of cheesy parts, like Dracula firing some sort of a energy pulse into the scary German guy's chest. I thought that was a little hokey, but it's an 80s movie, so you're going to have some of that. 7 out of 10 is pretty solid. I think it holds up to this day, and I feel like if you want a fun movie that's not going to be too gory, right amount of scares, language isn't brutal, I think this is something you could sit down and watch with your kids, obviously, depending on the age. This one's a good one. Knocked out of the park. That is it. That is all. I'll see you monsters on the other side.